Dylan Mason hadn't expected to inherit anything from his Uncle Walter. They hadn't spoken in years, not since that bitter falling out between his father and Walter over some land dispute Dylan never fully understood. But when the envelope arrived thick, official, with the embossed seal of the county clerk's office, he stood motionless in the kitchen for several minutes, wondering what unfinished business had finally landed on his doorstep. It wasn't a letter of apology. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a deed. The house, the land, the full parcel, it was all his now. The last remaining piece of his family's legacy. And, perhaps foolishly, Dylan saw it as a kind of peace offering from the grave. The property was located in a quiet residential development 2 hours outside the city. Not quite rural, but not the sort of place you stumbled into without intention. It sat at the end of a cul-de-sac shaped like a hook. The house itself nestled behind a thick veil of hedges and old oaks that had clearly outlived the neighborhood's design trends. It was an aging craftsman with a strong frame and sun-faded shutters untouched by renovation but still proud. Dylan, a methodical man by nature and profession, stood on the warped porch steps the first time he visited, scanning every line of the architecture with a mental checklist. Rot in the beams, sag in the gutter. The front door leaned slightly to the left, as though tired of resisting time. He liked it immediately. For a man who had spent most of his adult life working as a systems analyst for municipal infrastructure, the kind of job that required patience, precision, and an unhealthy tolerance for bureaucratic ambiguity, the idea of restoring a family home appealed to something quiet and buried inside him. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't imagine white picket fences or sunset porch drinks. What he imagined was control, stability, ownership of something no one could revise or recall. He began the paperwork within the week. The first month was uneventful in all the right ways. Dylan cleaned out the old furniture, which ranged from antique to outright hazardous, cataloged structural issues, and scheduled basic inspections for utilities and foundation work. He even had the title confirmed and recertified with the county. Everything was moving slowly, but cleanly until a letter arrived from a group calling themselves the Winmer Community Council. The tone of the letter was courteous, even welcoming. It invited him to a monthly neighborhood harmony review, described the group's mission to preserve unified aesthetics, and kindly asked him to submit a declaration of his intended improvements to the property, including color samples, garden layout, and window type. Dylan reread the letter twice. He wasn't unfamiliar with these kinds of neighborhood associations. They sprang up in developments all the time, sometimes with good intentions, sometimes not. But the kicker came at the bottom, in smaller print. All changes to external property must be approved in accordance with Council Visual Ordinance 4. Unregistered properties shall be subject to conditional review, regardless of previous standing. It was vague enough to sound legitimate and pushy enough to make his jaw tighten. He ignored it. There was no record of his property being part of any mandatory association, and Dylan had already cross-referenced the land parcel with public zoning. As far as the state was concerned, his lot stood independent. He tossed the letter into the drawer beside his tools and moved on. 2 weeks later, he was interrupted mid-paint stripping by a knock at the door. A woman in her late 50s, with a narrow, perfectly symmetrical face and a practiced, steel-tipped smile, stood in a beige blouse and lavender slacks, holding a clipboard like it was an extension of her arm. She introduced herself as Karen Reed, chair of the Winmer Council. Her voice was calm, professional, and patronizing in the way someone might speak to a distracted child playing with wires. She complimented his ambition in taking on such a restoration, then asked if he'd had a chance to review the council's packet. Dylan replied, flatly, that he had, and no, he wouldn't be submitting anything for review. The conversation twisted then subtly, almost imperceptibly. Karen tilted her head, as though confused, then clarified that participation was not optional. Dylan countered that his property, as recorded by the county, held no such obligation. She smiled again, tighter this time, and said, "You'll find we operate under a slightly different structure here." What happened next would have been comical if it hadn't felt so invasive. She extended her hand and asked to see the deed, the original. Dylan, irritated but calm, went inside, retrieved the certified copy he kept in a folder by the front table, and handed it to her. She examined it wordlessly for a few seconds, then, without warning, tore it in half. Her movements were efficient, even practiced, as if this act wasn't spontaneous at all but something rehearsed. She handed the torn halves back to him and said, "This doesn't mean what you think it does." Dylan didn't move. He didn't raise his voice or react. He simply looked at the torn paper in his hand, the black ink split down the center, the edges still curling from the violence of the motion, and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a low, methodical burn behind his ribs. Not anger, not disbelief, strategy. Karen turned and walked off the porch, her heels clicking in polite disapproval against the wood. As she reached the sidewalk, she called over her shoulder, "Oh, and do be aware unregistered property is in violation of Visual Ordinance 7. We'll need to address that before next month." That night, Dylan didn't sleep. He sat at the small kitchen table, surrounded by printouts, property lines, historic filings, zoning maps. He dug into his uncle's records, including handwritten notes and correspondences that Walter had, apparently fastidiously maintained. He found letters from the early 2000s, contesting the same council and asserting the independence of the land from their oversight. A legal battle had begun, but from the looks of it, had never concluded. Walter had simply stopped responding, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe something else. By morning, Dylan had made 3 decisions. First, to reissue a certified copy of the deed from the courthouse. Second, to hire a property law attorney, not some bargain type, but one who knew land use and zoning like scripture. And third, to prepare for the possibility that this wouldn't be resolved with emails or polite conversation. Karen had torn his deed in broad daylight without fear of consequence. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a message. He stepped outside just after sunrise and stood on the edge of his lawn, looking down the length of the street. Winmer looked normal, sleepy, suburban, borderline sterile in its landscaping. But Dylan saw it differently now, not as a place to build a home, as a territory, one where lines were already being redrawn, and he would not be the next man to quietly let it happen. Not this time. The silence that had initially comforted Dylan about Winmere began to shift in tone after the incident with the torn deed. There was something almost tactical in how the neighborhood seemed to carry on unaffected. No one mentioned what had happened. No one approached him. No one even acknowledged the encounter. Yet subtle signs began to appear that something had changed. It started with a simple observation. The mailbox, which Dylan had freshly repainted himself in the original style of the house, was suddenly replaced. A plain, generic black box with the words Standard Community Unit printed on the side stood in its place, bolted into the same post, as if it had always been there. He found the old one, the one with brass accents and beveled edges, discarded neatly in a garbage bag at the edge of his driveway. No note, no explanation. It had simply been removed like an unauthorized fixture. The following week, his renovation contractor, a local, hard-nosed carpenter named Miguel, who had agreed to help reinforce the front porch, called to cancel the project. Miguel was apologetic, even embarrassed, and admitted that he'd received a call from someone representing the council who had informed him that any work done on the property would need special approval, and that working without it could place his license under review. Dylan pressed him for names, for specifics, but Miguel just kept repeating, "They knew my license number. They knew my business registration. I've got kids, man." Dylan didn't blame him. He just hung up the phone, sat down on the bottom step of the front porch, and stared at the street for several minutes, noting how everything around him looked perfectly normal: the trimmed hedges, the spotless sidewalks, the distant whir of a leaf blower. But beneath it all, he sensed it now. That curated perfection wasn't the result of pride or neighborly goodwill. It was enforcement. Within days, it became increasingly clear that the surrounding homes weren't so much participating in this aesthetic harmony as they were trapped in it. Dylan noticed how often the same silver SUV circled the block, how the same woman watered the same patch of lawn at the exact same time every morning. Every trash can stood precisely aligned to the curb on collection day, exactly 12 inches apart. He began to recognize patterns in the quiet that bordered on ritual. And yet, despite the scrutiny, no one ever spoke directly to him. They watched from windows, paused as they walked by, nodded tightly if caught in eye contact, but never said a word. One morning, Dylan stepped out to find his driveway blocked by 2 orange traffic cones. No markings, no signs, just sitting there like a suggestion turned command. A white sheet of printer paper, wrapped in clear plastic and duct taped to the garage, bore a single line of text, "Pending review, do not alter." He took the cones and moved them aside without hesitation. As he did, he noticed a second car parked down the street, a black sedan with no front plate. Inside, a man wearing sunglasses pretended to look at his phone. Dylan didn't engage him. He simply returned inside and began documenting. He photographed the cones, the sign, the car, and began compiling a folder, not for revenge or escalation, but for clarity. He was building a record, not of conflict, but of pressure. The next push came subtly through infrastructure. His trash collection stopped. First for a day, then for a full week. Calls to the sanitation department bounced between departments, no one claiming responsibility, no one finding his address in their database. He eventually had to drive his own garbage to the transfer station, where he was asked to fill out a temporary disposals form, because properties within Winmer have a separate contract. Dylan asked to see the contract. No one could provide it. Then came the notice. Not from any court, not from a city office, but delivered by hand slid under the door in a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a form letter printed on cream-colored paper with an embossed header reading Winmer Oversight Committee. It informed him that, due to inconsistencies in documentation and non-alignment with community statutes, his property was being placed under temporary custodial review. No definition of the term followed. No contact name was given. But the letter ended with a directive. Until ownership is validated through internal review, all external activity must cease. Alteration, construction, or utility use may be subject to administrative correction. That phrase, administrative correction, lingered in Dylan's mind for hours. It didn't sound legal. It didn't sound official. It sounded like a threat couched in polite language, designed to sound legitimate enough to intimidate but vague enough to avoid direct consequence. It was legal theater. And Dylan understood something then. This wasn't about property. It wasn't even about aesthetics. This was about attrition. They weren't trying to beat him in court. They were trying to wear him down, isolate, confuse, and outlast him. That night, his power cut out. Not from a storm, not from a blown fuse. The box had been manually switched off. He confirmed it himself, inspecting the panel behind the house, where a red plastic lockout tag now hung over the master switch. The tag read service hold pending admin review. His name wasn't on it. Neither was a company's. Just a 6-digit internal reference number. He didn't panic. He didn't even curse. He lit a single lamp powered by a backup battery, pulled out his folder of evidence, and began marking each incident on a calendar. He was going to give the attorney everything. The letters, the signs, the replaced mailbox, the blocked driveway, the altered trash service, and now, this unlawful tampering with utilities. He would press for an injunction. He would sue if necessary. He would not be bullied off land that had legally belonged to his family for over 50 years. The next morning, things escalated in a way that would have made him laugh if it hadn't felt so absurd. A man in a reflective vest stood at the edge of his property with a handheld scanner, pointing it at various corners of the yard like he was mapping an invisible blueprint. When Dylan approached and asked what he was doing, the man calmly responded, "Just updating perimeter metrics for parcel integration." Dylan asked him under whose authority. The man smiled blankly and said, "The committee, sir. You should have received the memo." Parcel integration, a phrase that meant nothing and everything, a phrase that implied transformation of boundaries, of identity, of ownership. Dylan felt the weight of it more than he could articulate. Someone was trying to redefine what his land was, right under his nose. Later that evening, Dylan received an email from a name he didn't recognize, counselcompliance@winmer.org. It was short, polite, and disturbingly precise. It informed him that non-compliant landscaping fixtures had been observed, and that a compliance officer would be conducting a visual inspection the following week. Attached was a grainy aerial image of his property. In it, he could see himself mid-step, walking toward the side gate. Someone had a drone. No sound, no permission, no announcement, just quiet surveillance. Dylan forwarded the email to his attorney and copied the city's zoning commission. He didn't expect immediate response, but he needed it in the record. He was building something stronger than indignation. He was building a case, slowly, carefully. He stood in his driveway just past midnight that night, staring up at the sky, wondering how long it would take before they realized he wasn't going anywhere. He hadn't declared war, but someone had declared it on him. And that, he thought, was a mistake. A very serious one. Dylan had always believed that people didn't go to war with each other, unless they'd exhausted all other means, but Winmer was testing that belief with unsettling efficiency. What had begun as a surreal bureaucratic skirmish now crept closer to something far more invasive, far more dangerous, and above all, personal. He could no longer deny that whatever power structure operated beneath the surface of this unnervingly pristine neighborhood was not merely enforcing aesthetic preferences or zoning quirks. It was executing a calculated campaign of destabilization, inch by inch, rule by invented rule. The moment Dylan received the second letter, hand-delivered and bearing no return address, yet composed with the same officious tone as the first, he knew the pressure was about to tighten. The letter stated that his property had been designated a visual conflict zone due to its failure to conform to surrounding symmetry norms. The absurdity of the language barely registered any more. Dylan simply circled the phrase in red pen and filed the letter alongside the others. But the real blow came 3 days later, when the city utility service's last independent connection outside of Winmer's grip refused to repair the power line that had been deliberately disabled. The technician who showed up on site took one look at the tagged switch, read the small community override label, and shook his head. "I can't touch that," he said plainly, as though explaining weather patterns. "It's out of our hands. Says here the easement's under temporary jurisdiction review." Dylan asked what that meant specifically, legally. The technician, kind enough but clearly under orders, just said, "You need to resolve that with the oversight board." Except no one could tell him who that board actually was. He began operating out of his truck, parking it on the edge of the property where the cell signal was clean, running a charging inverter off the battery, and tethering his laptop through a mobile hotspot. He used the downtime to draft a formal complaint addressed to the county, citing illegal interference with utilities, unauthorized zoning actions, and denial of basic services. He submitted everything through official channels. No dramatic emails, no public posts, just systematic, methodical escalation. It was the only way to remain credible. But even that measure of caution was not enough to keep what was coming next from slamming directly into him with the subtlety of a freight train. Early one morning, well before sunrise, Dylan returned from a brief supply run, mostly fuel canisters for the generator and bottled water, only to find a white van parked at the mouth of his driveway. It bore no logos. No license plate. Inside sat 2 men. They weren't pretending to be delivermen or city workers. They didn't even look up when Dylan approached. He stopped his truck short and walked the rest of the way, hands in plain sight, not to confront but to observe. The passenger side window was down slightly. From within came the low murmur of a radio, and nothing else. The driver, a man with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses, said only one thing before rolling the window up: "Property evaluation in progress. Please return later." That was the moment Dylan felt something truly shift, not in the neighborhood, but in himself. It wasn't fear. It wasn't rage. It was resolve crystallizing into something colder. He took 3 deliberate steps back, turned without another word, and walked into his house. Inside, he unplugged the surge battery and initiated a remote call to the county assessor's office. He needed confirmation of any active inspections. None were listed. The woman on the line, confused but cooperative, confirmed that no parcel reviews had been scheduled for his property. He documented the call, saved the log, and recorded the time the van eventually pulled away 6:14 a.m. sharp. That same evening, he heard voices outside. Not loud, not overtly threatening, but the type of rehearsed cadence used in tours or site evaluations. Peering out through the side blinds, Dylan saw 3 people, 2 men, 1 woman standing at the edge of his lawn, pointing at his porch, taking notes on digital tablets. One of them took a photograph of the house, not covertly, but as though it were procedure. Dylan stepped outside and asked them for identification. They looked at him as if surprised he could speak. The tallest of the men replied, "We're conducting a structural feasibility review for eventual lot harmonization." Dylan asked again who they worked for. The woman responded curtly, "Winmer Compliance Team." "You should have received the 24-hour notice." There had been no such notice. No paper, no email, no phone call. They left as calmly as they had arrived, but their presence lingered, as did the implication they were already planning for a future that didn't include him. That night, Dylan reinforced the front gate, not out of paranoia, but necessity. He was being squeezed. Not attacked, squeezed. Made to feel uncertain in his own home, unsafe on his own land, disposable in the eyes of an anonymous structure that wielded just enough pseudo-legitimacy to operate unchecked. But it wasn't until the morning after, when he found his garage door partially open, the lock cleanly removed, no forced entry, no damage, just absent, that the weight of the situation became clear. Someone had entered and done nothing. Nothing was stolen. Nothing moved. They'd gone inside, looked around, and left. It was a message, not one of violence, but one of access. They could come and go as they pleased. Dylan filed a report with the sheriff's office, but even as the deputy took his statement, it was clear no action would be taken. The deputy, a young man with a thin mustache and tired eyes, listened patiently but with visible caution. "These developments have their own internal codes," he said. "Gray areas, especially when easements and permits get revised. Technically, we can't intervene unless there's proof of forced entry or damage." Dylan stared at him for a long moment before replying. "So what you're telling me is, until they break something or hurt someone, they're untouchable." The deputy didn't answer. He just handed back the report with a polite nod and drove away. By the end of the week, Dylan's mail had stopped arriving. The post office claimed a temporary hold due to routing changes. His attorney called to inform him that a public request had been submitted to reclassify his property as in process reallocation zone, language that meant nothing under state code but was apparently being considered at a local administrative hearing one Dylan had never been notified about. The walls were closing in, not with hammers, but with paperwork. His water pressure dropped by half. City Water claimed a valve alignment conflict. Packages were returned to sender. Visitors were turned away at the gate by guards that claimed they were on patrol for unauthorized entry. Dylan hadn't called for any patrols. But the final blow came when he arrived home from a legal consultation and found the side of his house tagged. Not with paint or graffiti that would have been too obvious, too crass. No, this was more surgical. A metal stake had been driven into the soil near his porch with a laminated notice attached to it. The sign read, "Occupancy hold, do not modify premises without permit." And above the notice, parked sideways in his own driveway, was a white Tesla with out-of-state plates, glinting under the late afternoon sun. The driver's seat was empty. The trunk was open. A folded chair and a cooler sat beside it, as if someone were settling in for the weekend. And on the cooler sat Karen. Legs crossed, face unreadable behind designer sunglasses, she didn't stand when he approached. She didn't even flinch. She simply sipped from a can of sparkling water, gestured to the stake, and said, "We're moving forward with Phase 2. You were notified. You chose not to comply." Dylan didn't answer. He didn't look at the stake. He didn't ask what Phase 2 was or who had approved it, or what fiction they'd used next to justify what they were doing. He simply walked past her, stepped into his house, locked the door, and stood silently in the center of his living room, surrounded by what remained of a life that was being carved away piece by piece. And as he stood there, something in him settled, not broken, not afraid, but still. Calculated. He understood now this wasn't a dispute. This was siege. And he would not be starved out. Not by her, not by anyone. Dylan didn't retaliate immediately. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't so much as confront Karen when she left her Tesla parked on his driveway for a second full day. Instead, he sat at the small kitchen table beneath the buzzing light that now only worked when the generator cooperated, and made a list. Not a list of enemies, not even a list of actions. He was long past that level of reaction. It was a list of facts, time-stamped, documented, cross-referenced against county records and utility schedules. The list included every data service had been interrupted, every letter delivered without identification, every photograph taken, every time a figure stood just outside the range of his cameras. It included badge numbers from the sheriff's office, copies of zoning documents, and the business license numbers of the contractors who had abruptly backed out under suspicious circumstances. It was not vengeance he was after, it was the construction of a wall. One that could stand in court. One that could expose what this quiet, suburban little group had become, a machine of coercion masked in legalese. And he wasn't building it alone. His attorney, Scott Fenwick, a man with a spine made of granite and a tone that made even judges uncomfortable, had begun digging into the records behind Winmer's community actions. What he uncovered wasn't criminal, not overtly, but it was surgical in its malice. Over the past 3 years, 6 properties had been reabsorbed into Winmer through a pattern of disputes, violations, and forced compliance orders. In each case, the owner had either moved out or sold at a loss, and the properties had then been transferred to entities with ties to the council. Not direct ownership, but management agreements, long-term leases, corporate proxies. It was legal, just barely, but it was not random. Scott compiled the data and contacted a regulatory oversight body, but warned Dylan not to expect miracles. "You're not fighting a person," he said. "You're fighting a pattern. And patterns are designed to outlast emotion." In the meantime, the pressure at the ground level intensified. Karen began leaving her car at different angles, making it impossible for Dylan to pull his truck in or out without risking damage. Her excuse, when questioned by the one officer who reluctantly responded, was that she was performing oversight presence duties. When Dylan asked for clarification, she replied with a smile, ensuring community boundaries are visually respected. She spoke like a school principal, but operated more like a chess player, never aggressive, always 2 moves ahead, always within reach of deniability. The other residents, though silent, were watching. Dylan noticed how a few of them, the ones who had once politely avoided him, now lingered longer when walking their dogs past his house, their eyes scanning the lawn, the porch, the generator cables, as though judging whether he belonged or whether he was already a ghost. The turning point came not from an external blow, but from a hole in their own logic. Scott, ever thorough, discovered that Winmer's development charter, the foundational document that allowed them to regulate aesthetics and bylaws, had an expiration clause buried in the fine print. The clause stated that any changes to zoning oversight must be approved by a supermajority of active deed-holding residents, not council members. This clause had never been removed, and more importantly, had never been triggered properly in any of the cases involving reabsorbed properties. It wasn't enough to overturn everything, but it was a crack. And Dylan knew what cracks meant: leverage. With Scott's help, he submitted a cease and desist letter, citing improper implementation of charter provisions. They didn't expect it to stop anything, and it didn't, but it forced Winmer to respond on paper. That response, a 2-page denial filled with vague references to interpretive scope and adaptive governance, became the linchpin of Scott's counteroffensive. Now there was written proof that they were operating outside their own charter. But Dylan still had a problem, a physical one. The car was still in his driveway, and the tag posted beside it. It had grown into a full laminated sign bolted to a stanchion, warning against unauthorized access or modification of community property. According to them, his land was no longer solely his, and any act against the vehicle could be seen as vandalism against shared community assets. It was a trap daring him to act rashly, to lash out, to give them grounds for a restraining order or criminal charge. He refused to bite. But he didn't intend to wait forever. That weekend, Dylan attended a private consultation with a land use mediator, not to resolve the conflict but to confirm one specific legal nuance. Under state law, if a vehicle is parked on private property without the owner's permission and is not registered to that address, it may be classified as an encroachment provided that the property owner takes action through a licensed third party, not an individual TOW, not a neighborly argument. A contractor, licensed, insured, documented. So Dylan made a call, not to a tow truck, to a crane operator. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the rig arrived. The crane, an aging but reliable model, was manned by a retired rigging foreman who had worked with Dylan on municipal projects years ago and owed him a favor. Everything was done by the book forms filed, work order printed, cameras rolling. The Tesla, still glinting in the sun like a polished threat, was carefully harnessed and lifted 3 feet into the air. Karen wasn't home, or so it seemed, but that didn't stop several neighbors from appearing on their porches, phones out, faces tense. No one said a word. Dylan didn't raise the car in triumph. He didn't taunt or celebrate. He simply gave the operator a quiet nod and pointed toward the unused, cement-lined retention pond that sat at the far end of Windmere's common grounds, a location that, according to community maps, did not fall within any single homeowner's parcel. The crane pivoted slowly. The car moved like a suspended ornament, and with calculated control, it was lowered into the empty basin, the straps released, and the vehicle left upright, perfectly centered, unbroken. A notice was posted to the basin's gate: vehicle relocated. Owner may recover upon proof of property right. Dylan went home and made coffee. For the first time in months, no one circled the block. No one parked outside. No one rang his bell. For now. For a brief stretch of time following the Tesla incident, things in Windmere appeared to regress into a tense but tolerable silence. No letters arrived, no new signs sprouted up on his lawn, and no strange men in unmarked vehicles hovered at the end of the driveway. Dylan had expected immediate retaliation. Instead, he got nothing. It was at first almost more unsettling. The absence of pressure felt strategic, like the sudden silence before the next barrage, and Dylan, being neither naive nor complacent, didn't trust it for a second. He continued documenting everything, filing updates with Scott, who had now looped in a land rights litigator from a larger firm in the city. They were building a more expansive case, not just about Dylan's property, but about Windmere's larger pattern of coercion. But progress in the legal realm was slow, and Dylan knew that whatever game the council was playing, they had no intention of waiting for a courtroom. It was 3 weeks after the crane operation that the first retaliation came, not to Dylan's face, but to his name. He discovered it when trying to refinance part of his late uncle's estate to cover upcoming legal fees. The banker, who had been warm and professional at the start of the process, suddenly turned cold during their second meeting. "We've run into an issue with your property's zoning flag," she explained, not meeting his eyes. "Apparently there's an encumbrance placed on the title, something about pending community restructuring." Dylan knew that wasn't possible. The title had been clean, verified, but when he requested a copy of the new public record, there was a digital note inserted into the county system marking the parcel as under review for jurisdictional adjustment. It wasn't an official designation, but it was enough to spook a lender. When he brought the document to Scott, the attorney's face went hard. "This is forged," he said, voice clipped. "It's using the old metadata tag system that was phased out 2 years ago. Whoever did this used an outdated template and hoped no one would notice." That should have been a small victory, but it only raised the stakes. Someone had impersonated a government process to interfere with Dylan's finances. That wasn't just harassment, that was felony-grade manipulation. They were escalating, and they weren't bothering with subtlety anymore. The following day, Dylan received a notice taped to his door, this one with a real logo, from the Department of Code Enforcement. It cited multiple violations: improper fencing height, unauthorized structural modifications, unregistered landscaping features. It was comically long, listing infractions down to the alleged misplacement of a bird feeder. Dillon knew none of it was enforceable. His property wasn't under their jurisdiction, but the notice included a mandatory court appearance. Someone in Windermere had filed the complaint through official channels, leveraging real bureaucracies for false ends. He appeared at the hearing with Scott and a binder of documents, ready for a fight. But the judge, after reviewing the jurisdictional boundaries and hearing testimony from a zoning official, dismissed the charges within 10 minutes. Still, the message had landed. They could force him into court. They could drain his time. They could make life grind, just slow enough to feel intolerable. Then came the fire inspection. It wasn't scheduled. There had been no request. But a white city truck pulled into his driveway with 2 men in uniform, claiming to be responding to a tip about illegal propane storage. Dillon didn't store propane. They claimed to have a report anonymous. They asked to inspect the premises. Dillon, legally within his rights, denied entry without a warrant. The lead inspector shrugged and left without incident. But the visit had accomplished its goal. Dillon now had to wonder what next anonymous complaint would be filed. It was psychological warfare via bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Scott's team confirmed what Dillon had long suspected: Karen was not acting alone. The council had formal ties to a real estate holding group registered under multiple shell corporations. That group had acquired 5 properties in Windermere at suspiciously reduced rates, always within a few months of major code disputes. On paper, everything was legal. In practice, it was a system of manufactured attrition: wear homeowners down until they sell or abandon, then sweep in to absorb the undervalued property. Dillon's refusal to fold had interrupted the pattern. Now they were trying to make an example of him. The social pressure intensified. Dillon found his face on a flyer distributed throughout the neighborhood, a black and white printout with the headline "Disruptive Element" and vague accusations of aggressive behavior, unauthorized alterations, and conflict with compliance personnel. Neighbors who had previously been indifferent now turned visibly distant. At the grocery store, a man muttered "troublemaker" as he walked by. A woman flinched when he reached for a shopping basket. The public image campaign had begun. They weren't trying to prove anything, just to seed suspicion, make his presence uncomfortable, ostracize him through soft alienation. His mailbox was smashed 3 nights in a row. He replaced it each time. Surveillance footage showed no faces, only hooded figures walking with the certainty of familiarity. He filed police reports. Nothing came of them. One evening, as he returned home, he found his gate chained shut, not with a padlock, but with wire twisted tight and knotted around the bars. It took him 20 minutes to cut through it. When he finally got inside, his security lights, rigged independently from the grid, were all dark. The wiring had been removed, not torn, but unscrewed, as if by someone who'd had time and confidence. He didn't panic. He rebuilt them. Stronger this time. He swapped in hardwired feeds, routed backup power through a UPS unit hidden inside the crawlspace, and moved his router to a concealed cabinet. He didn't share the upgrades. He didn't even mention them to Scott. Some information, Dillon believed, was best left unspoken. Then, one morning, the power returned. It wasn't a restoration. No trucks. No notifications. Just one morning, the lights flickered and came back on. Dillon didn't trust it. He checked the box. The tags were gone. The lock replaced by a new one, this one tagged with a barcode and a plastic seal. He contacted the utility company. They had no record of any recent service. The records showed his account as inactive, yet the power flowed, not free, not rogue, but rerouted, undocumented. Scott suspected a local override. A fake reconnection designed not to help but to ensnare. If Dillon used the power, and it later emerged that he was drawing from an unauthorized grid, he could be charged with theft of service. So Dillon shut it back off. He lived in the dark, ran his devices through solar panels, and logged every minute of uptime. He was done playing their game. But Karen wasn't. 2 days after the flyer campaign began, she returned in person. This time she didn't sit. She walked straight up the driveway while Dylan stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching. She wore the same sunglasses, the same smile, but her voice had changed, no longer friendly, no longer pretending. "You're destabilizing the block," she said plainly. "People are nervous. This used to be a peaceful place. Now it's a battleground." Dylan said nothing. She took a step closer. "You could make this easy. Sell. Take the offer. Move on." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "There's an offer now." Karen nodded. "It's generous. Above market. But only for the next 30 days. After that, we'll have to file under forced reassessment. You'll lose that margin, maybe more." Dylan held her gaze. "You done?" She didn't blink. "You're making things harder than they need to be." Dylan replied, "You have no idea how hard I'm willing to make them." Karen left. No more threats. No more posturing. She turned and walked back down the driveway like someone who believed she'd already won. That night, Dylan moved all physical documents into a fireproof safe bolted to the foundation. He rotated passwords, recalibrated all external cameras, and for the first time wrote a letter to the press, not an expose, not a plea, just a detailed account, signed, dated, notarized. He didn't mail it. He didn't need to. He just wanted it ready. Because if they wanted escalation, real escalation, he was prepared. Not just to respond. To end it. The night the lights came back on for the second time, Dylan didn't turn them off. He sat in the chair by the window, watching the street glow with that same artificial calm, and let the current hum quietly through the house like a trap wired with the anticipation of a wrong move. He knew it wasn't his power, knew it was another provocation, another test of whether he'd act impulsively, whether he'd finally give them the mistake they needed. But he also knew the pattern now. They were running out of tactics. They'd exhausted their legal facades, their soft social pressure, their forged documents and weaponized inspections. This wasn't a community protecting its interests. It was a syndicate closing ranks around the last property it hadn't consumed. And for all its polish, for all its smug bureaucracy and staged legality, Windermere was cracking under its own weight. It just didn't know it yet. The first crack came from the county registrar's office. Scott's team had requested a full audit of property filings linked to Windermere's oversight committee and its financial partners. What they found was a mistake, small but fatal. One of the reabsorbed homes, acquired just 6 months prior, had never had its ownership properly transferred. The transaction had been recorded, but the title never cleared escrow due to a missed notarization. The property had been claimed, renovated, and even leased, but technically, it was still owned by the original resident, an elderly man who had left the state without ever officially surrendering title. When Scott confronted the holding company representing the council, their legal team froze. It wasn't a forgery. It wasn't fraud. It was worse. It was negligence, the kind that cast doubt on every other acquisition Windermere had made in the last 5 years. Dylan didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. The pressure had already started to shift. The silence in the neighborhood changed pitch from orchestrated indifference to quiet avoidance. Some residents, once compliant and complicit, began leaving their porch lights off, their blinds closed. A few even stopped watering their lawns. A whisper of disruption had entered the bloodstream of Windermere, and in a place that worshipped order, nothing was more dangerous than doubt. But Karen wasn't finished. She resurfaced not with another visit or veiled threat, but with a lawsuit. It landed in Dylan's mailbox, a thick envelope marked with a private process server's insignia. Inside, a formal complaint filed in civil court accusing Dylan of destruction of private property, endangerment, and malicious interference with community operations. The primary charge focused on the Tesla, not just its relocation, but the emotional damage and financial loss allegedly suffered by Karen due to its placement in the retention pond. The language was absurd, theatrical, laced with manufactured outrage and inflated estimates. But it was also signed, filed, and scheduled. Karen had finally played her last real card, the public accusation, not in committee meetings or whispers behind hedges, but in front of a judge. Dillon arrived at the courthouse alone, dressed clean but without ceremony. Scott was already inside, calm and unreadable. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by 2 attorneys and wearing a soft cream blazer, her hair pinned into a perfect coil. She didn't look at Dillon. She didn't need to. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about control, about salvaging the illusion that Windermere was still unbreakable. The hearing was brief, clinical, and brutal. Scott dismantled their argument piece by piece, beginning with jurisdiction. The retention pond was not designated as private property under any public record, and therefore not protected under personal vehicle statutes. The crane removal had been conducted by a licensed operator under a documented request, filed in response to an unauthorized vehicle parked on Dillon's property. There had been no damage, no vandalism, no malice. Every move Dillon made had been pre-approved, filmed, and filed. The judge, a stern woman with a taste for precision, asked one question: why didn't the vehicle owner remove it themselves when asked? Karen's attorney stammered something about confusion, miscommunication. But the damage was done. The case was dismissed with prejudice. No appeals, no do-overs. Officially on record, Dillon had done nothing wrong. But the consequences didn't stop there. The judge, clearly frustrated by what she deemed a misuse of court resources, filed a recommendation for administrative review of Windermere's internal practices. It was a formal referral, dry, bureaucratic, but lethal. It triggered an automatic audit from the State Housing Board. Within days, a team of inspectors began reviewing council actions, property records, zoning changes. Their badges were real. Their questions weren't friendly. And for the first time, Windermere had to answer to someone it couldn't ignore. Karen resigned that week. The letter wasn't public. No announcement was made. But Dillon found a copy of it printed and crumpled in the community bulletin box the morning after a single paragraph citing health reasons and a desire to pursue personal reflection. She didn't return for her car. She didn't come to collect anything. One of the council members, a man Dillon had never seen without mirrored sunglasses, came and quietly removed the Tesla from the retention pond using a flatbed with no markings. The sign was never replaced. The week after the resignation, Dillon received a letter of his own. Not from Windermere, not from the council, but from the Department of Municipal Planning. It confirmed, in plain language, that his property had never fallen under the jurisdiction of the neighborhood's regulatory framework. Furthermore, any attempts to alter that status would now require a formal, public hearing with unanimous consent from the County Review Board. A legal firewall, permanently recorded, signed, stamped. He pinned it to the wall beside the generator switch. That night, as Dillon stood on the porch, the street was quiet again, not the tense, watchful silence of before, but something emptier, older. No one passed. No lights glared. Even the drone of distant sprinklers had gone still. The neighborhood hadn't changed. The fences were still white. The lawns still trimmed. But something beneath the surface had broken loose, not just in the council, in the whole idea of what Windermere had built. The perfection had cracked. And in that crack, Dillon stood unbroken, unbought, and unbowed. The days that followed moved not with triumph, but with a peculiar stillness, the kind that settles after a long storm, not because the damage has been undone, but because everyone is too exhausted to keep pretending it didn't happen. Dillon didn't expect parades or apologies. He didn't wait for a neighbor to knock and say they were wrong. He didn't even look out the window with anticipation anymore. There was no final act to this story, no dramatic gesture that wrapped it all with closure. What there was instead was clarity, a rare and sober silence that made everything sharper, colder, realer than it had ever been. The house was still his, more than ever now, and yet it felt different in a way that had nothing to do with the court papers or title confirmations. It felt claimed, not inherited, not granted, but earned through resistance. Windermere moved forward like a machine that had lost a gear. The council was restructured, which in practice meant replaced entirely by a consultancy hired by the county for oversight until a permanent framework could be implemented. Dylan saw the memos taped on light posts, printed in neutral fonts with phrases like transitional administration and interim regulatory schedule. The language was dry, impersonal, but underneath it was the silent admission that something inside the machine had broken beyond easy repair. Meetings were canceled, community events suspended, and the clipboard patrols that once circled the streets with routine precision had disappeared altogether. Karen, for all her force and posture, vanished like a ghost that no one wanted to admit had ever existed. Her name wasn't mentioned. No one came looking. Her house was put up for sale, handled discreetly by a third-party agent. Dylan noticed the sign go up one morning while drinking coffee by the porch window. The same porch she once stood beneath, making declarations about boundaries and decorum. He didn't go out to watch them pack her things. He didn't need to. She was already gone in every way that mattered. Inside, Dylan took to restoring what had been left unfinished: the porch steps, the attic insulation, the rewiring of the back outlets. There was something satisfying about those small physical acts, something honest in the weight of a hammer and the logic of measurements. He worked slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of respect. Every board he replaced was part of a house that had withstood more than just weather. It had become, in the end, the only place in Windmere that hadn't flinched. And so he built not as a man chasing a project, but as someone laying down something that might last long after the dust of petty control had settled. He left a crane invoice pinned to his fridge, a reminder, not a trophy. On the back of it, scribbled in pencil, was the final item from his list: never ask permission to keep what's already yours. He crossed it off without ceremony. Neighbors began to reappear, slowly, tentatively, not with casseroles or conversations, but with glances, nods, silent acknowledgments that something had been settled, even if no one had the courage to say exactly what. One afternoon, a man in his 60s walking a Labrador paused by Dylan's gate and said, without looking up, "Took guts, what you did." Most would have folded. Dylan didn't reply. The man didn't wait for one. He kept walking, and that was the most honest peace offering Dylan could have asked for. He installed a new gate lock, upgraded the perimeter lights, not because he expected more trouble, but because he now understood what it meant to live in a place that could smile while putting a knife in your back. There would always be another Karen somewhere, another system trying to dress control as consensus. But now, Dylan knew what it looked like, how it moved, and more importantly how it failed when someone refused to move. One evening, as the sun burned low behind the trees, Dylan sat on the rebuilt porch steps with a fresh cup of black coffee. The house stood quiet behind him, solid and steady. Across the street, two new residents pulled into what had once been a council home. Young couple, out-of-state plates, no sign of clippered alliances. They didn't wave. They didn't look nervous. They just unloaded their things in peace. Maybe they'd heard the stories. Maybe not. Maybe it didn't matter. The neighborhood was still quiet. The lawn still trimmed. The fences still white. But somewhere in that order, a message had been carved, not on paper, not in court filings, but in action. No one tears up your deed and walks away clean. And if they try, you drop the car, right where it can't be ignored.